This module will cover what is the IEP process, Module 2. The objectives for this unit are that you, as pre-service educators, will identify the purpose and components of a high-quality IEP. You will understand key procedural and substantive requirements of a high-quality IEP, and you will recognize the most common procedural and substantive errors made by IEP teams. There are different types of IEPs and IEP processes. There is an initial IEP. When you go through this process, it's important that we know that we're looking at a full and individual initial evaluation. And we're determining the eligibility for special education. An IEP team must have developed the initial IEP, and it's called an EER, or an Education Evaluation Report. And so the special education team looks at all the services and the related services that may be made available to the learner as soon as possible. An initial IEP may be developed in conjunction with eligibility determination or as a separate meeting within 30 days of the date of eligibility. So that IEP would have to be written within 30 days. Prior to an initial IEP meeting, we have to contact all IEP team members to schedule that initial IEP meeting. We invite the appropriate IEP team members using the meeting notice. We prepare the IEP meeting using the EER. So that would be me as the consultant. It has to have an overview of the general education curriculum, expected standards, the classroom management strategies, recent district-wide assessments, classroom management assessments, results, observation, and interview data. You want that to be extremely complete. And then that draft IEP is developed so that when the team meets, eligibility can be determined. During that initial IEP meeting, IEP team members are introduced, the roles are reviewed, and the responsibilities. And parents are provided this procedural safeguards manual. It is a very lengthy manual. As you can see, there's several different forms. That's early access, excuse me. I provide one for ages for 21. I don't see it on this site. I will get that to you from 3 to 21. Oh, here it is. But what I do is I just go through and I review their rights. So I don't go through all of that. And I will show that to you, but it's very important that you review those rights and provide them with that manual. So you provide them a draft IEP. You do not finalize that before the meeting. Review the information gathered in preparation for the meeting, develop and write the IEP, establish the learner's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, develop annual goals, determine and describe the services, supports, and activities, determine the least restrictive environment, and establish progress monitoring and reporting. So at this time is when you'd also have to inform and obtain parent consent using the consent for initial services. After that initial meeting, you're going to finalize the documentation of the decision. And parents are provided that prior written notice. So it's a prior written notice, and you document all of things that were proposed or refused for the learner's educational program. And it's called a PWN. And we will practice writing those. So if it was recommended for a math goal, reading goal, speech goal, and then exactly what those were recommended. And then the full continuum of services. The time frame in which parents will receive final documentation should be agreed upon at the IEP meeting. Parents should always receive a final copy in a reasonable time frame. Implement the IEP as written, and then monitor progress and provide progress update to parents. Initial IEPs prior to age 3. The earliest age an IEP may be implemented for an eligible individual is 2 years and 9 months. So in the case of a rare and unusual circumstance that an IEP was being considered for a child younger than 2, the IFSP team would need to contact the Director of Special Education to seek prior approval. I don't deal with IFSPs, so there are early childhood that do the IFSP. So, and that's in early access. So you would have to work with early access and you have to get a special degree for early access. Your other type of IEP is your review or your annual IEPs. These are conducted every year, at least once a year. The IEP team must review the eligible individual's IEP to determine if the annual goals are being achieved and to revise the IEP as appropriate. When revising an IEP, the team must address the following: progress toward their annual goals in the general education curriculum, results of any reevaluation, information about the learner provided to the parent, um, the learner's anticipated needs for the coming year, and any other relevant information to the development of the IEP. So we look at any changes that have been made. Prior to a review IEP meeting, contact all IEP team members to schedule the IEP meeting. So you have to contact everybody to see if it'll work. Invite the appropriate IEP team members using a meeting notice. If any required team members are unable to attend, they must be excused prior to the IEP. Prepare for the IEP meeting. Information that would be helpful to review in advance and to have available at an IEP meeting. So you need to look at the general education curriculum and expected standards, classroom management strategies, recent district-wide assessment results, classroom assessment results, recent evaluation, progress monitoring, observation, and interview data. It's always okay to have a draft IEP, but remember, it's a draft and all team members are a part of that. During the review, you always introduce the IEP team members, their roles, their responsibilities. You go over the procedural safeguards. I will show you a summary, and then I'll show you how to go over that. The IEP team may utilize the draft during the meeting, as well as they work towards finalizing that. There's always things that are reviewed and changes are made. Review the information gathered in preparation for the meeting, specifically the learner's growth and progress since the previous IEP. Develop and write the IEP, establish the learner's present levels of academic achievement. We go through the RIOT process. It's called our review. So we might review their grades, their attendance. The I is interview teachers, students, parents. The O would be observe. T, test. I will show you some other things with that riot. C, determine and describe the services, supports, and activities. D, determine the least restrictive environment. Remember, that's not always the general education setting. We want that to be, but sometimes the team may decide that there's a continuum, that they need the general education for the most time, but they may need some support within the special education setting. Establish progress monitoring and reporting. Finalize the decisions of the IEP team, and then inform parents that they will be receiving a prior written notice of a proposed or refused action on a PWN and final copy of the IEP once everything is finalized. You need to give them a specific time when all of that will be finalized. And then after reviewing the IEP meeting, finalize the documentation on the PWN, the IEP, provide them with a prior written notice of the proposed and refused actions. They both need to be documented on there. And then and a final copy of the IEP in a reasonable amount of time. For parents that choose to use the parent portal, the final IEP should be made available to them in a Achieve. I'm not sure if that's up and running yet, but it is supposed to be. Implement the IEP as written. monitor progress, and provide progress updates to parents in the manner determined by the IEP team. So interim IEPs that happen or amendments. When an IEP team determines that it is necessary to temporarily provide special education supports and related services to an eligible individual, an interim IEP may be developed. An interim IEP shall not be in place for more than 30 school days. Excuse me, this would be like if a student moves from out of state. This is part of the evaluation process before an IEP is finalized to aid in determining the appropriate services for the individual, or if an eligible individual has moved from one LEA to another and a copy of the current IEP is not available. So it doesn't happen too often, but that would be like if students moved and we're waiting to get their IEP. So you'd want to contact all the IEP team members to schedule that meeting, invite the appropriate IEP team members using a meeting notice, document if somebody's not able to attend, prepare for the IEP meeting, information that would be helpful to review in advance, an overview of, again, of the standards. A draft IEP can be developed. During that, again, this is the same. Introduce the members, the roles, responsibilities, procedural safeguards, review any existing information available. The IEP team may utilize a draft IEP, develop and write an interim IEP, establish their learners' present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, develop annual goals, determine and describe the services, supports, and activities, determine the least restrictive environment, establish progress monitoring and reporting. If the IEP team determines evaluation information is needed and additional information is needed, that's when we have to get consent for it's not a reevaluation anymore, but it's consent for additional information. So then we would have to have their signature. After an interim IEP meeting, finalize documentation of the decisions of the IEP team in the IEP. Provide parents with a prior written notice of proposed or refused actions. And then we also need to change the identification or placement or change in the provision of a free appropriate public education. We always want to make sure we have them in the right placement. Provide parents with a copy of the IEP if a reasonable time frame. Implement the IEP as written, monitor progress, updates to parents. And then, of course, at the end of the conclusion of an interim IEP, not more than 30 school days, we would need to review the evaluation data collected and then determine is the student still an eligible individual? The IEP team must develop an IEP for the learner. Then amendments. An existing IEP may be amended to make changes to a learner's program. Amending IEPs. An IEP team may amend an existing IEP with or without a meeting. If a meeting is not held, it is necessary to ensure that all key members of the IEP team meaningfully participate in the amendment process. Amending an IEP does not change the anniversary date of the IEP. There are no specific restrictions on the use of amendments to make changes in a learner's educational program or the kind of changes to an IEP. An existing IEP may be amended as often as necessary. The extent of the changes and the proximity to the learner's IEP anniversary date should be considered in making the decision. And then here's the steps. So we need to determine the potential need to amend the existing IEP and that an amendment is an appropriate process. Contact the parents to discuss the areas of potential change through the mutual agreement, whether or not a meeting will be held. If a meeting is not held, the IEP team must document who's agreed to amend the IEP without a meeting. Consider and discuss the sections of the IEP which need to be changed. An AEA or LEA may only agree to change in the IEP concerning the resources. Document the agreed upon changes on the IEP. Finalize documentation. Provide a PWN and then the proposed or refused actions. Provide a final copy, and then implement the IEP. And then monitor progress. And then there's also the trial placement, 45-day trial out. An IEP team may consider implementing a trial placement, often referred as a 45-day trial out, when considering decreasing or discontinuing a specific special education service, or all special education eligibility. Um, they may use multiple data sources such as district-wide assessments, IEP goal attainment, and progress monitoring, available assessment data sources, and information from teachers and parents. The key question, though, is can the individual's unique needs be met successfully in the general education curriculum with the instruction and supports made to all students? So when this happens, we have to inform the parents at the beginning of the trial placement when the eligibility is being questioned. All services are being trialed out. A reevaluation is required at the conclusion of the trial period. So then the IEP team should provide and obtain notice and consent for the reevaluation. So we need, when will the trial placement begin? Who will be involved? What supports are needed? How will they be fated? What will be monitored? Who will monitor? How often will monitoring occur? What is the length of time? Then during the trial placement, implement the trial placement as documented in the IEP. Collect data and monitor the learner's student progress on a regular basis. So, if it's not being successful, then the IEP team should act immediately. And then after the trial placement, we need to reconvene the IEP team to consider if the learner is ready to discontinue or do they need special education services. If eligibility was in question at the initiation of the trial placement, a reevaluation is necessary, and then we document that on the PWN. I hope you found that to be helpful. Let me see here. I know I have something else that I need, to share with you. I think we'll do that next time. It was on number 5. Oh, procedural safeguards manual. So when you review the procedural safeguards manual, it's really important to involve parents in the IEP process. So they can be given the informed written consent before their child can be tested. They can initiate the special education referral for their process. They for the evaluation, the student must be assessed in all areas of concern or potential needs voiced by the parents. Parents also have the right to request an evaluation of their child. When it comes to eligibility determination, parents must be part of the team that makes the eligibility decision, which is based on the evaluation results. Parents are equal members of the IEP team, and as such, their input regarding all aspects of the IEP must be considered and respected. Before the student's IEP can be implemented, the parents must give informed written consent following implementation of the IEP. So when we look at the procedural safeguards, we have to conduct a thorough individualized evaluation, adhere to required timelines, ensure attendance by all necessary team members, include the necessary components, and implement the services as written in the IEP. So it's really important to go through this process and make sure that you go through um the the hold on, baby. Just a second, Bretta. Just a second. Potty. Then you can get a snack. Go potty. it's important that we include all the necessary components and content. So here we have a few team leaders or teachers that talk about this.
You have to build relationships. Building relationships is the key component to meeting their students' needs, meeting the parents' needs. Every year, that child needs some type of evaluation of that IEP. I want to meet with parents so we can discuss what this IEP entails, because parents might not know the questions to ask. The first thing that I ask them is, what are your concerns and what are the goals that you want for your child for this year? And I feel like that allows the parent to open up to say, yes, here are my concerns. I just feel like that's very important because they know their child better than we do. And they see different things at home than we do at school. They have that bird's eye view of their child and can communicate that information to help develop that IEP.
So in the state of Tennessee, if a draft of the IEP was developed prior to the IEP meeting, parents should have access to that draft at least 48 hours prior to that meeting. I like that because I think parents walking in having no idea what we're about to say, where we're about to say their child is in terms of present levels and PLAFs, that's a lot of information to take in that meeting and then process. If they're hit with something that they don't expect, it can be so emotional that they don't really hear anything else we say for the rest of that meeting and may not process it for a day or two after they've left the meeting, which makes it really hard for them to be a team member because they're caught up in something that took them by surprise.
So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, as we've talked about a little before, is the law that governs the education of students with disabilities. You're going to get to know a lot more about it, but it ensures that the IEP process, the how and when of IEP development is followed. It ensures the IEP contains all the required information, the PLAF statements, measurable annual goals, the description of special education related services and supplementary services, the method for measuring and reporting progress, the explanation of the extent the student will not be educated with non-disabled students in the general education setting, statements of students' participation in state and district-wide assessments, the date of service initiation, frequency, duration, and location. Again, please remember that this IRIS Center is a really good website to use. Another important piece here you're going to get to know are the IEP team members that are involved. When you go around the table, it's important to introduce yourself as well as the responsibilities of those at the table. So before we get to class, I want you guys to kind of get to know these documents. Today I'm going to teach you about the PLAF, or present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. This statement is that of a child's cornerstone of the IEP. It drives the IEP and it links all of the components together. The purpose of the PLAF is to identify the child's needs and establish a baseline of their performance and appropriate activities. It identifies specific needs and establishes a baseline that begins the process of developing meaningful and measurable goals. The PLAF statement is a brief and understandable narrative that accurately describes the child's performance in all areas of education and functional activities that are affected by the child's educational performance, and it serves as a bridge between the evaluation process and the measurable annual goals. It's important to remember that this is not a full repeat of the evaluation team report. This statement must contain at a minimum, information about the child's current functioning and information about the impact of their disability. It also should include appropriate activities. The IEP must contain measurable baseline data, and we pulled this from the PLAF. Another location on the IEP. We summarize the data and establish a baseline. So the PLAP should include and be stated in terms that are specific, measurable, and objective, describe current performance, not past performance, describe the effect of the disability on the child's progress in appropriate activities, prioritize and identify needs that will be written as goals, identify strengths as they relate to possible interventions, provide baseline data for each need, and set the measurement method for each goal. The PLAF must also include statements that are appropriate regarding health, vision, hearing, social emotional status, general intelligence, educational performance, communication status, motor abilities, and developmental status. Parental concerns are also important here because many times IEP goals are written from there. So, appropriate activities are those that are defined that children would like to take part in. So there should be a direct relationship between the PLAP and the measurable annual goals. So each need needs to be identified in the PLAP. So most needs are addressed as measurable goals. Some can be addressed in other ways. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So you will have access to this documentation guide within the course. So part of the PLAP we'll talk about is the present levels. Here we want to engage parents and students in the IEP process. I always interview all of my students, and you'll have access to all of that. You would establish a context for discussion. You put assessment data in there, and this drives the IEP goals. You include their strengths, interests, and preferences for each student. Strengths are general things the student's good at. This one says singing, telling jokes, math computation, sports. Because I teach at the high school level, I always include living, learning, and working. Here, they also include, for preschool children, this may include strengths associated with the developmental skills on the Iowa Early Learning Standards. So, and I always state where I get the information. So if I interview the students, because I like to talk to my students. So when interviewing Mary, she stated that she is good at singing, telling jokes. When using an interview, and so you always state where you get the information from. Interest are things or events or people that evoke the student's curiosity. And here again, it talks about preschool children. You can also include things they're interested in learning more about. Preferences. These are things, events, or people that the student chooses over others. I always include how they prefer to learn. Mary stated she prefers to learn in small groups. She prefers to learn with her hands. She prefers to learn using a computer. So those are things you can include. When using an interest inventory, Mary indicated she prefers. So those are some things there. The next section is parents' concerns. The IEP is required to consider the concerns of the parents for enhancing the education of their child. Sometimes these are general statements. We would like more help in the area of math. We don't think her reading is coming along. Sometimes the parents will say, currently I don't have any concerns. I always write, so-and-so's parents stated. I always write what they say exactly. The next section are the special considerations. And you just mark each part. So this means that if it's only addressed in this IEP, that the area represents a concern and that at least some information is provided but that it may not have a goal. Under other information, you'll write the effect of the disability, that they may have some service and supports. If behavior is of some concern, but classroom or program-wide positive behavior supports are having a beneficial effect, and they're unnecessary, the team would check the first option and can know relevant information. And so, however, if the behavior is more significant, and then you have to write a functional behavior assessment, and it's good to track this information. And then it goes on to talk about each of the additional pieces. This is a really important document to get to know, and it has all of the pieces. So I hope it helps to have gone over this. And then you will work on practicing writing a PLAP in your small groups. So when you come to class, it will be important that you have already watched that, because you will come and being prepared to practice writing a PLAF. So that is all I have for Module 2.